We had a couple. We just wanted to make sure that cameras and mics were all set up. A few of us were jumping from call to call. I am Jeremy Bloom. I am the founder, chief mentor of OhHello.io, which launches next week. Woo! Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Trace. Thank you, Patrick. With us today, we have Trace Rutland, Patrick Reiter, and Sarah Sitz. I'm going to have each of you introduce yourself in about a moment. But the reason for why we're doing this is all four of us are in MarTech, AdTech, media, software. We all have different backgrounds, but what is obviously one of the hottest topics in our ecosystem, retail media. There's retail media madness. And so when each of us was talking independently over the past few weeks, different conversations about retail and retail media came up during that dialogue. And so what I thought would be beneficial is getting three legends within our ecosystem to talk and to opine and to converse and have a dialogue with our OhHello community. So our OhHello community, we've got a bunch of viewers right now that are going to be asking questions, but I'm going to shut up for a second and I'm going to go and ask Trace to kindly introduce herself.
Hi, yes, I'm Trace Rutland. I noticed I didn't put my last name on the when I signed in, but I am currently doing consulting work for a little company that I made up called Tenacious Tech and Media. That's how people describe me, positively or negatively. I'm definitely tenacious. And I've been around the block a couple of times, started out on the agency side. I've been client side and CPG exclusively since 2010. I'm at Mars, Hershey, Tyson Foods, most recently of Ocean Spray. And I came from a media background, but have a strong passion around MarTech and where the two intersect. And you really can't talk about MarTech and media without talking about retail media. So, and I'm glad to see, this conversation happening as well as other about, where does retail media live in the ecosystem?
So well said, Trace. And what fantastic experiences you've had all across CPG. So you've had a tremendous amount of experience within this ecosystem. So it's going to be great to hear your 2 cents. Let's go to Sarah. Sarah Sitz.
Hi. I'm Sarah Sitz. I own a company. I'm a co-founder of a company called The Squeeze. We like to say it's where authentic brands find their juice. But really, we are a brand marketing and retail consulting firm. My partner and I most recently came from Foxtrot Market. We took the company from Series A to C, and so we consider ourselves experts when it comes to brand building, what it really means to be a brand in the consumer space today, and how you think thoughtfully about, how you differentiate, what your marketing strategy looks like, and ultimately how you launch and sustain in retail. My background prior to Foxtrot has been primarily on the brand side, working for kind of omni-channel businesses such as Grubhub and Cars, and then I started my career in media. So always growth-minded, but a brand marketer at the end of the day.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Patrick.
Yes, good to be with you. Congrats on the impending launch, Jeremy. Very exciting.
Thank you.
My background started in the agency side, and then spent quite a bit of time at Target where I had different roles, e-commerce, retail marketing, and then helped them stand up kind of the retail media network, which today is called Roundel. And then moved into more traditional marketing roles at places like Etsy and a number of startups. So moved kind of from larger companies to smaller companies. And currently I'm getting interested in retail media again, as I was a few years back. So it's interesting to see what's transpired in that space and in the past few years. Still tons of opportunity and such an exciting time for retail media. But I'm doing a little bit of consulting and considering potentially a full-time role as well. But I have a strong entrepreneurial streak, so I'm kind of weighing the scales on which direction to go. So we'll see, but it's an exciting time.
That's amazing. And so, Patrick, the fact that we met about a decade ago through our mutual friend Phil Numerick. Shout out to Phil, love you, buddy. But when we met, something that was really unique was I actually learned about retail media a decade ago from you. I didn't really, at first, when I was at TubeMogul, I was selling a video DSP and didn't completely understand. And you and your team explained the process in a meeting to me. So thank you. And so I thought that by going full circle, it would behoove all of us to really understand just where the ecosystem, how it's evolved over time. So if you can kind of just maybe take a moment to talk about what it was back then to like what it's become and your time at Etsy as well. I think that it would be really great for people to understand and hear from someone who helped build the framework and built the economic model behind this.
Well, there's a lot there. I mean, when I was immersed in this space, the word retail media didn't exist. Amazon, Walmart, and Target were selling ads. And I think the big question then was really around, is this shopper marketing or is this something else? Is this incremental in lots of different ways, but incremental from a revenue standpoint was always a big question internally that we had. Or are we just cannibalizing our shopper marketing dollars? And then for the brands, is incremental? Are we changing people's behavior? Is this beneficial to the consumer and to the brand? And I think both those questions probably are still lingering, I think. But that's kind of where we're at. My personal experience really was in building capabilities for Target. My team had taken on to sort of building, better target audience capabilities and leveraging our customer data for that, leveraging our customer data to surface insights and gain a deeper understanding into the consumer, and then leveraging consumer data, customer data to develop new measurement. And there were different variants of that, but we call it closed loop measurement was the most important. If we reach somebody with a marketing asset, can we connect that marketing asset, that exposure to an in-store purchase or an online purchase? And so spent a lot of time developing that capability. And what I and I think others realized inside Target was these capabilities are useful not only for Target and for our marketing campaigns, but other marketers would want this. This is not the holy grail, but getting us closer to the holy grail of some of the sort of quintessential marketing questions of when I commit this marketing action, what's the outcome? And then can I reach these specific groups of people? Can I reach cereal buyers in store in Ohio? And the answer is yes. Here's the list of them. We've got 2 million of them in the last 30 days, right? So that level of fidelity was intriguing, I think. And so my role was in helping transform selling ads on Target.com into what we would think about today as retail media, which is sort of discrete target audiences, improved measurement, depending on the strategy of the retail media, an infinite inventory pool, things like that. And so that was kind of where I got involved. And then beginning to think about it as a marketing driver as well as a revenue driver. And I think now the interesting thing to me is the third leg of that stool, which is what's the benefit of the customer, especially being in the startup space. And Sarah and Trace probably can identify that, being customer centric and always having that at the forefront. What's the value? What's the incremental value to the customer? I think is incredibly interesting. And so now as I kind of circle back around on this space, it's that third leg of the stool, adding that to what's the value of the brand, what's the value of the retailer, and now the consumer. All three legs of that stool is really interesting. And I think for me personally, that's where the current fascination lies in the industry. So
great explanation. Thank you. Trace, why don't you talk a bit about being on the marketer side, on the media side, on the advertising side, representing for a decade plus top tier brands like Mars, like Hershey's, Tyson, Ocean Spray, putting all of those brands in front of the consumer and using retail media back then and how it's been evolving.
Sure. And actually, Patrick hit on a couple of things. So I think one of the things that advertisers face at this point, especially in CPG, is the fact that shopper versus retail, because they are different, but they do intersect. And when you're thinking about how things organize and fall out inside of a CPG, if you don't put the two together, you run the risk of redundancy between the two efforts. And then even when you get to budget, there becomes some discrepancy and some confusion from senior management. So one of the things that I've done in the past is really work to pull those two together from a standpoint of an organization, not necessarily from a standpoint of functionality, because they cross over and function similarly in some ways and are very different in others. So I think, and especially in the olden days when it was first becoming a thing, I think now there's certainly more delineation between the two, but I think early on it felt very similar. So I think that's one of the first challenges is I think anytime, and I know agencies really have this struggle too about when there's something new, where do you put it? Where does it live? To the point of, is it media or is it different? I mean, in my mind, I always think about being very consumer centric and what does the consumer see? And they don't see the difference. That's something that, we certainly see with our eye when we're on a site or look at something, we know the difference, but the consumer doesn't. And so since the consumer doesn't, should we be thinking about it separately or together? And so that becomes really the provocation in that space. And then it's always a fight for allocation of dollars, right? And where does it go? And I don't think I'm sharing any big secrets that a lot of the retail media customers, because inside of CPG, we generally think of our customers as being our retail partners, and then our consumers as being the people who actually buy the product. So we think about our customers as like Walmart, Target, Walgreens, CVS, Kroger's, all of those. I don't want to make anybody feel left out, but that's who we think of as being our customers when we use that language. And then the consumers is obviously the individuals who buy the products. So thinking about, sometimes there are customer requirements on how much money you have to invest from a shopper and from a retail media standpoint. And so that all has to come out of a budget, and then it becomes whose budget does it come out of? So I think you can get really deep into that rabbit hole. I'm not now, because again, I think it's really much more important to look at it from the standpoint of the consumer and where it lives and really what you're trying to accomplish. I think of shoppers being something that's really about driving people to a store to buy the product, whereas I think of retail media as just being a different way to talk to the consumer and a different way to find the targeting. So I think that's the other piece of it. I think for a long time, manufacturers and advertisers have really wanted to get behind the scenes in terms of the data that they collect. CPG is not, I know P&G and Unilever have made big strides in collecting and having first-party data, but most CPGs, your average CPG doesn't have a lot of first-party data. So as they think to target and segment, the challenge becomes where to find that data. We know our retail partners have that data, but how do we talk about it and share it in a way that protects everyone's interest? It allows, that monetization that we know our retail partners are looking for. And we certainly support, all businesses making money. We just want to make sure that things happen in a way that's mutually beneficial, I think is the biggest concern from the advertiser side.
Thanks, Trace. Patrick, I saw a lot of nodding, especially in the past 20, 30 seconds. Why don't you hop in? Because
it's somewhat pedantic, so we won't belabor it. But I think it was interesting for me to hear Trace articulate the difference between the customer and the consumer from the vantage point of a CPG, because for so many years I've been in direct to consumer, and in some way or another we've been direct to consumer, and so the consumer and the customer is the same person, right? So I just use those terms interchangeably. Mm-hmm. But it was just interesting for me, and this is definitely inside baseball, but to hear Trace articulate that was interesting. And then, just how a CPG thinks about it is just interesting to me, because again, I haven't never been on that side of the desk from a retail media standpoint, and I haven't had that sort of viewpoint since very early in my career in the agency days when I did sports CPG. So that was
OhHello,
where my mind was going.
Amazing. So it feels good to bridge smart people together and to be able to have these kinds of discussions. with that said, Sarah, help us understand, like, give us a little bit of your understanding, your experience having been on the agency side, then helping to be part of a marketing team at Grubhub, then co-leading marketing at Foxtrot, which is, in my opinion, a very high-end boutique convenience store, corner store. Why don't you explain a little bit more about just like the return to retail and just your 2 cents, as that's what you were living and breathing for quite some time?
Yeah. I think a little bit of like hearing that the D2C heyday has ended a bit, right? Like the days of just being able to throw dollars on social and search and get as many people to your website as possible and see that turn. And so I think what we're seeing, in general for our current clients and, as we were building our own business, right, is how do you balance both and think about, an omni-channel customer and think about, the journey of how you're marketing to them. So Trace, I completely agree. We always thought about, consumer first, human first, right? And then, how do you start to see the way that people are shopping differently, right? Like, let's not always go back to COVID, but the reality is, like, in the post-COVID world, a lot more people want more tangible touch experience with the products they're buying, whether that be in CPG or elsewhere. And so I think you've started to see this shift to not only brands building more brick and mortar, right, but starting to invest much more heavily in retail, knowing they're seeing that foot traffic start to increase. And so, I think retail never went anywhere by any means, right? But you're just starting to see a more hungry shopper within retail environment. And I think it fulfills that need to start to invest in retail more, and the reliance on making sure that the dollars are focused, within the stores that you see the highest value in.
What are the pain points that you would see, that a consumer sees, that a marketer sees?
I think the problem is the reliance of it, especially for smaller brands, right? So we work with a lot of growing brands, and there's this like achievement of getting on Target's shelf, but then what's next, right? So yes, I got there, but now in order to stay there, I need to think really thoughtfully about how I'm going to spend my finite dollars, sustain the demand that I'm going to start to see from being on shelf, and then make sure that I'm there 6 to 12 months from now. So I think what we're talking to a lot of brands about is like, let's not just think about how to get there, but what's your plan to get there, to stay there, and then to be there in 2 years from now. And I think there's just a lot of brands that are spending other dollars to even just produce the product to begin with. And so then to have to invest on a platform to even be found is really tough to kind of balance that need, because you really have to pay to play on these platforms in order to even be discovered if you're not going to be walking through those doors and incremental to walking through those doors.
Trace, I see you nodding. What's your 2 cents?
Sure. I mean, yeah, sorry, I was on mute.
It's okay.
Sure. Yeah. I mean that you're right. Getting on shelf is always your biggest concern. And then I think, we don't talk enough about digital shelf and what that looks like too, because that becomes an important part. And, we think about it in D2C standpoint, which is certainly, and you can't ignore Amazon really as our retail media piece of this too. And we don't, we don't really talk about that usually because that's been around, I think, for so long. We don't even really think about it. But I think, but yeah, getting on shelf is key. Staying on shelf is also important, because that's another challenge you have, especially for a big CPG, when you launch a new brand variation, or you are launching a totally new product, a smaller product line, a business line. And so you have to think about that. And then, past that, how to stay there. And then how to combine your digital efforts with your brick and mortar. So I think there's not a point where, and again, to your point about COVID kind of changing the paradigm, I'll say that it didn't change the paradigm as much as I thought it was going to, in terms of, I think people have gone back to store more than I expected them to. But I will say that, I do think it did help ingrain digital shopping habits within, across the consumer landscape, and not just for, I always call us the precious few who have been digital for a long time. I think it got kind of the average American more accustomed to shopping digitally, but how far will that go? I mean, I think we've had a swing back to brick and mortar. Now I think we'll probably see a swing back onto the digital side. But I think digital shelf is something you have to think about when you talk about retail media. I mean, it's part of the process.
Oh, I completely agree with you. I mean, I think we at Foxtrot, we found this really nice sweet spot, right? Because we were all these people that had never shopped online before or through delivery, right? Started to be like, oh, this is something within that I can do. I'm not scared of anymore, right? And so I think I agree with you completely. There's a whole new audience now that is way more comfortable online shopping than they ever were before, combined with the fact that they, are craving more of this like experience incrementally.
Good point. Good point. In your experience, Sarah, just because you had worked with obviously some smaller up and coming local boutique kind of brands, direct consumer brands, along with larger brands as well. When you Trace and Patrick were just talking about just thinking through the life cycle, thinking through, okay, how much needs to be produced? How do you get on the shelves? Then how do you think through from a capital component of, okay, do we have enough to create all of this product over the next 6 months? Have we met with all of our suppliers? Do we have enough corn, enough soy, enough carbonated water, whatever it might be, enough sugar to go and infuse and create these products? What are some trends that any of you have seen in your experiences that the average consumer isn't thinking about, or the average marketer might not be thinking about when it comes to getting a product? Okay, you're in Foxtrot, you're in Target, you're in Dollar General, whatever it might be, whomever it might be. What's next? How should brands be thinking about that? How should marketers be thinking about that?
I can answer that. I mean, I think more on the upfront, to be honest, the way that we're working with a lot of our clients is like really isolating like your white space, right? There are so many brands that are being produced that are like a net new idea that are hungry within categories. And I think we're really trying to help brands focus on brand first, right? So what do you stand for? What are you trying to achieve? Where's the white space and the consumer opportunity? And really, really nail that consumer down and then start to build out your retail strategy accordingly, right? I think a lot of brands, as they're building fundamentally are like, get me to Whole Foods, right? And we're like, well, what's your like dovetail approach to how you get there, right? Like, how are you being discovered within independent retailers first, and then how do you expand versus running? And so I think we're trying to do a lot more work in the upfront with clients on, let's really make sure you know who you are, who are you going after, and where's the biggest opportunity? Because like, this is super simplistic. We do so much teacher work because like, where are you within the curve within your category, and then that starts to help validate where you're starting to investment too, or even what are you bidding against? Who are you playing against? Like, are you in the bakery or like as a cookie, or are you frozen, or are you someone that's, a quick grab and go item? And so I think we really try to think thoughtfully from soup to nuts, like in placement within categories, because then I think it helps build a stronger investment strategy to think about even who you're competing with against and why in the upfront.
What brands are doing it right in your collective minds? It's a hard question. Didn't put this in our notes. What retail media networks are doing it right? Who's doing something unique? Like, let's think about, if we can't, maybe we can organically get back to the brand question, but when we look at Instacart IPOing yesterday and we see all the traction that took place and we see all of the news and we see, okay, this potentially is going to open the doors for a lot more tech companies to IPO and a lot more brands to jump into the marketplace. Talk through your 2 cents, perhaps, on what's taking place in the ecosystem in terms of just as a retail media network like Instacart, when they're able to, it took them over a decade to get to where they are, but it's obviously a big deal when they're able to go into the public markets. Patrick, you've had amazing experiences both at Target and Etsy, working at 2 publicly traded companies. Trace, you've worked at publicly traded companies and private companies. Would love to just have you guys opine on that.
I think that
was a lot to unpack.
I'm going to
pick and choose. I'm throwing anything at you, and you pick what you want to cover.
Well, I think relative to brands and retail media sort of enterprises, you have to add value, right? And that when you're good at adding value, and you can do that over long periods of time, you're generally going to win. And let's call that like product, right? You've got a great product. And then marketing can help enhance that and amplify that, right? So I think that's the key ultimately. Complementing what Sarah said, my background has been predominantly like direct to consumer. So while brand is incredibly important and is a meaningful lever, changing a brand position, appealing to a new audience, and expanding your TAM, your addressable market, those things super meaningful. Tactically, we typically start with a forecast and then pair actions up against that forecast on a timeline, and that's kind of how we operate. And that's like growth or growth marketing. So that's sort of a different answer to the first question, or the previous question about like, what's the way in? How do you plan and forecast? And so we typically start. My experience typically starting with the outcome, the revenue, profitability goals. If it's a digital business, traffic, conversion rate, order value, orders, all those things, all very metric driven, outcome oriented. So the outcome is where you begin. And then you work backward, you assess your optionality. What are the things that we could do? What's the level of effort? How do those things fit in a time scale? And you produce a plan. So I think it's a different way of doing it, maybe than a strict like retail view, which makes sense. It should be different. And I think they complement each other. But I think that the common thing here is the outcome and the value. If you're not adding value, then it's going to be problematic. And so that to me is the kind of where everything comes together is, do you have a really strong value prop? And for retail media, I think it's that value prop to the retail entity, the brand, and the consumer. And it's that intersection or overlap that I think will fuel a lot of the innovation moving forward.
Such a great point about the value. When you think about how congested and saturated the space is getting with all the different retail media networks, all the different options, as a marketer, you have hundreds, if not thousands, of different options of where you want to spend your money, what forms of media you want to use. And when all of these different brick and mortar companies are developing retail media networks.
Tongue tie.
Yeah. You knew where I was going. Thank you. As more and more retail media networks are ascending and popping up, is it just too much? Is it becoming too complicated? Like, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think from the consumer standpoint, they probably have standbys that they're, in terms of retailers and behaviors like, Instacart versus, some local service. And then there's like, the immediate ones who've not done so well. Like, I think GoPuff is struggling, but I know, Uber's tried to launch something similar to Instacart. Grubhub, I think too, wants to deliver, packaged, versus restaurant food, things from like 7-Eleven and CVS and those types of things. So I think on our end, it's very fragmented. On the consumer's end, I think it's more, kind of their habits and learned behaviors. I think something to think about too, in this, the startup versus, more established brands and more traditional companies. I think it's a time when brand's more important than ever in certain categories. I mean, we've seen how disruptive the mattress category's been, right? Which is very different than CPG. But at the same time, I think when you're going online to search for something like a good example is when you go on Instacart, you can put in a product or a brand and a product, so like, a good example would be like, you could put in chocolate candy or Easter candy or, whatever event candy you want, or you can put in, Snickers or Reese's or, Peeps, right? So, and when you do that, it gives you all the retailers that sell that particular product. So you can do some, price comparison and, SKU comparison in terms of, how big of a bag of Peeps do you really need or whatever, so I think branding's more important than ever. to talk about brands versus startups. I think startups, when they have a very unique proposition, I think they win. I think brands win when it's more of a pantry item. It's easier because, and I think, and I actually looked into this when we were investigating at Tyson audio ordering, ordering through like an Alexa or through Google. That hasn't taken off. I'm not surprised, but just, in terms of investigating, you kind of realize that even if you're typing in, you can either type in toilet paper or you can type in Charmin, and you're going to get a very different result. So I think from a brand standpoint, being branded certainly is an advantage and is something that needs to be thought about a lot more inside of the whole digital shopping experience. I do think, you're thinking about and to kind of like pivot a little bit.
Yeah.
So there's that part of it. And then I think there's also the part, the retail media network and using it for targeting. Because again, CPGs and a lot of other and certainly smaller brands don't have that first party data, and looking to a retail media network to help find those segments, especially for, less common or less commoditized types of products. So, finding, a good example with Tyson is, chicken is a pretty broad search term, right? But like Tyson has dino nuggets. If you have small kids, what those are. Then that's a very specific term. So you don't want someone to search for chicken nuggets. You want them to search for dino nuggets. And how do you train the consumer to do that? Isn't just through pure play and branding, but it's also through your retail experience, your retail networks. You want to show up when they're purchasing as much as dino nuggets, as much as when you show up for just chicken. So I think there's a lot of challenges. I think it's a really exciting time. I think there's a lot of, and to your point, there's so much out there in terms of retail media networks. Everybody, spring up. Delta, I think, Delta announced I think maybe even 6 months or a year ago that they're launching, which I think makes a lot of sense because of the data that they have and their ability to target and, just kind of figuring out what makes sense there.
Yeah. United Airlines has just launched their retail media network. The list goes on and on and on. Love just what you hit on, Trace. Sarah, from your experience, like, how can brands differentiate in order to like really make that kind of impact when different brands are commoditized? So, Trace, you mentioned Peeps. There are very few products that are like Peeps. They're incredibly seasonal. They are the texture, the branding, the colors, everything that comes with it. But if Sarah, from your experience, and as you for the Squeeze, for your consultancy, for your practice, when you're dealing with different marketers, like what kind of advice or guidance do you tell them just to be able to differentiate themselves from going to the macro brands that we inherently have seen and have known about for so long?
Yeah, I'll answer that in a couple different ways because I think the reality is not only are startups today or brands competing against each other, but they're also competing against the retailers themselves, right? So there's this massive shift to private label. Like you walk into a Target, even I, who's like, I'm obsessed with private label. We built like 100 brands at Foxtrot, but you walk around and the reality is every single category is private label, right? And so not only are they competing against the big guys of the world, but they're competing against the retailer themselves. And so it is so important that you are consistent in what you stand for and what you believe in and what you're trying to solve for at the end of the day, right? I think to answer your other question about brands that I think are doing it well, at least on the growing brand sides, like both, I think like Poppy and Olipop right now are in this like competitive category ownership, and they're both getting super innovative in their approach to their investment within both the physical retail as well as digital. And I think they do it really well because they've evolved their brand over time. So they're not the same brands they were like in their beginnings, but now that they've landed on, their value prop, they're hitting it over and over and over again, no matter where you see them, what channel it is. And then they're tripling their investment in places that make sense to them, whether that's, TikTok or within, a retail landscape. And so I think another brand too, I fangirl a lot for Dough. Sabina's done an amazing job of like cracking within a category, you know, sweets and a better for you, and really like committing to that value prop. And then, you know, having a brand identity and a voice that they're consistent with no matter what, and being super unapologetic about it. And so that's not for everyone though, right? Maybe you're not a brand that is provocative, but that's okay. But just be who you are through and through. And so I think we really coach whether that's verbally in your sampling strategy, right? And being really smart about who's touching your brand, because every extension of your brand is going to drive purchase at the end of the day. And so I think we're just hammering through consistency, owning your elevator pitch, you know, and making sure whatever version of that, whether that's an ad at its smallest form, or, you know, you're producing a piece of video content, that you're consistent in who you are.
Great points. Any other topics that we haven't discussed that you guys want to hit on just collectively as a group before we open up the chats? What about, we didn't have this in the notes, but I'll throw a couple curveballs at you. What about when it comes to measurement, when it comes to attribution, when we think about targeting, when we think about audience, and we think about, okay, well, the cookie's going to be going away. We've said it's going to be going away for quite some time, but what are the benefits that the retail media networks have? What are the disadvantages that different brands are going to succumb or overcome? Who wants to tackle these first?
I mean, I'm happy to jump on that one because it's a constant problem. You know, and I think, you know, because let's just be upfront, targeting always costs there's an additional layer of cost with targeting. So, and, you know, regardless of whether you do it from a programmatic standpoint or with a direct relationship, and then, you know, add the layer on of a retail network, because that's sort of somewhere in between, right? So in order to really, you know, justify the cost, you have to know that you're going to get that targeting. And I think one of the advantages that maybe retail media networks could bring is verification, right? Because we that kind of, you know, an ongoing joke I've always felt about targeting is, you know, we all just sort of turn a blind eye to the fact that none of that's auditable or verifiable, that we reached, you know, a man 35 to 54 with 2 kids who lives in, you know, with an income of, you know, 50K. I mean, we just take someone's word for it that we've reached that. Well, there's no, at that end, on the other end, you know, we know how many impressions we got that we think hit our target. But we don't really have any way to verify that, which, you know, I think there's, so we think it works, but do we really know that it's really worked? And I think retail media networks could give us that in some form. I think that's an opportunity for all of them out there, is to actually be able to find some way to prove that they've hit the target. And I think having the targeting, I mean, available inside of retail media network is invaluable, because I think because it's so fragmented, that's why we really need that additional targeting segmentation. Because as people, you know, I think we used to talk about the long tail a lot, and I think we've kind of realized the long tail isn't as great as, you know, and as powerful or impactful as we had hoped. And so now we're thinking differently in terms of that. So, you know, where are the audiences we're seeking? If they're not on tiny bespoke sites, or like, you know, I always call it Billy Bob's bait and tackle, where are these people? And I think, you know, we can find them inside of those retail media networks. But I think the challenge, and when you start talking about attribution and measurement, is, yeah, you can provide, even if you provide verifiable results from your retail media network, and I, you know, pick one, Roundel is fine. You know, even if Roundel can tell a CPG that they've actually reached that target, you know, being able to find those same people elsewhere outside of that network can't be done. So basically, it's a little bit walled garden steroids in some ways, because now you have just basically an ecosystem of walled gardens between retail media networks and Meta, and Alphabet or Google. So you're just struggling to get data back from a CPG standpoint or from an advertiser standpoint. You're struggling, and you certainly can't follow, even with the best, universal ID solution. It's still just, it's an approximation, and you hope you're getting it right. And you hope sales go up, and you hope you can attribute sales going up to you getting it, you getting your targeting refined. But I think it's a place for retail media networks, if we could all find a way to, exist together. I've even thought about, is there a clean room solution that we can, where advertisers and retail media can interface? Is that some sort of solution? So, I mean, I'm certainly up for suggestions, because I think, it's not a problem that's going to go away.
Patrick, thank you, Trace.
Yeah, I mean, I think the clean room is a good example of maybe an early stage type solution. I think generally the consensus is that it's high effort, it's cumbersome, but I think it's a good example of cooperation and cooperating on the right things that are mutually beneficial. So I'm when I say there's an opportunity for the three legs of the stool to come together, I think it's a good example of kind of an early effort that we can look at and say that's in that sphere. So exciting things to come out of that. On the walled garden question is interesting, and I think that the consensus seems to be that there's only room for so many walled gardens, and I think that's probably true. What I'm less certain of is, does it matter? I mean, Amazon is probably the leader in the space, right? I think most people would say they probably are, and they're a walled garden, and they're probably most likely to stay a walled garden. So is that a bad thing? And I don't know. I think what I feel more strongly about is that what I think the inevitable consolidation will be beneficial. How that comes together, I don't know exactly. I just think Instacart's really interesting in that space, because they're playing across, lots of retailers, lots of last mile places where they have transactions. So that's really interesting to me. And there's a lot of unique dynamics there that we'll see how that'll play out, but very interesting. But there's definitely room for aggregators in this space. And I think that's the other side of the consolidation, is the rise of aggregation. And who knows? I mean, that could be these are bad examples because it didn't go well. But in the cable industry, there was Project Canoe back in the day, which was like a consortium that it failed. But could some of these players come together and work together? That's interesting. Could it be a third party like a Meta? It could be, for sure. I mean, I think we can all envision that. I don't know how exciting that is to people, but I definitely see us as at like the precipice of kind of that next wave of innovation that'll answer some of these questions. So it's exciting.
We've got a great question here from John Barinello. Overall, do you see RMN's targeting worth the added cost, or what are some of the factors you have seen that demonstrate when it's clear advantage for advertisers? Who wants to take that? Trace, I think I see your mouth moving, but I think
sorry about that. I have a dog that's like lapping up water very loudly.
Oh, it's all good. We're all dog fans. Everyone on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. If you're not a dog fan, don't be a fan of OhHello. Like, we're dog people.
But I mean, in terms of, I think, is it targeted? Is targeting worth the added cost? And I think if you can show through like an MMM or, I don't know, multi-touch attribution. I mean, I think it, we have an attribution problem and we have a targeting problem, and they go together and they kind of equally stress everybody out and make it hard for everybody. If we can, if you can attribute, I mean, the bottom line is, if you can attribute an added cost to increase sales or incremental sales, then you can, obviously it's not a problem, because everybody's willing to go and spend that extra cost to yield revenue. I think the challenge is proving it, and proving it, because when you think about last touch or last mile and all of that, how do you really prove that, because people don't just go to in one place to look for one thing. They spend a lot of time looking, especially for new products, right? And investigating and comparing and price shopping. So someone could, Amazon's a great example. Most people in a brick and mortar store will use Amazon rating and reviews and to make decisions about purchases, and they'll do price comparisons on their phone in a store. But how do because of walled gardens and I understand everybody wanting to monetize, but that also keeps us from figuring out really who's doing the heavy lifting, right? In terms of the decision that the customer made to buy your particular brand. So I've completely not answered your question, because I think the problem is we don't have that. But I think if you can demonstrate in some way that link between the additional cost in using a retail media network and purchase, and especially an incremental purchase, because if it's something someone's buying anyway, who cares, right? It's nice to know, but it's not vital. But being able to really prove it through is changing the shopper experience or the dynamic. Yeah, people, we're going to pay. Advertisers are going to pay what they need to do that. So, yeah.
And I would just add to that, Trace. I think as long as it's part of a more holistic strategy, right? If you're just going to invest in one, in a retail media network independently, obviously you're not going to necessarily see that return. But I think if it's part of a broader strategy that's combined, to your earlier point around your promotional efforts, when you want to start to see more of that uptick, your balance of your evergreen approach and then heavy hitting, I think it's definitely advantageous for people to be investing here. It's just, maybe being a little bit more comfortable with what you're getting back and layering on, incremental, working with third-party researchers, incrementally to get more of that closing the loop data that you're looking for.
Yeah, and I would answer similarly. Yeah, I think absolutely it has to connect to a greater strategy. I think the less sexy answer is it depends. I remember there were use cases or examples where advertisers had said, we're done with this micro targeting, and it was because they had gone too far. They had sliced the apple too thin, and they made the right choice to back off from that. But the answer wasn't to not do any of it. I think it was to look back on the strategy and your objectives and see, where does this make sense? Where do we go from here? But I'll end on this point with a success example. We had launched grocery as a new category in Target. And so we started experimenting with shoppers, online shoppers and in-store shoppers, but more importantly, shoppers by category, apparel shoppers, electronic shoppers, et cetera, and understanding where is the propensity to shop grocery, right? And so we're using it for insights and performance purchases. But by creating these discrete cohorts, we could say, okay, apparel shoppers are, 75% less likely to convert to our new grocery category. There's some hesitancy there. We don't know why, but we know they're not converting. Conversely, electronics buyers are all over it. They're converting at a much higher rate. So as an insight driver, it was really useful in tactically informing the launch of grocery. So that was an example where it was really, really useful.
Thank you, Patrick. So as we look at the clock, we've got a few minutes left and want to make sure that everyone has time to hop into their next meeting, their next Zoom, whatever it might be. Any parting words of wisdom, any other advice that you guys can each give on the space? And before you do that, I just want to say thank you to our viewers. Thank you to our listeners. Thank you to the three of you. Thank you, Trace. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Patrick, for A, being on this panel, and B, being part of the OhHello community. It means a lot. Excited to have you on our platform when we launch next week. Sarah, parting words of wisdom.
Parting words would be, don't ever be afraid to test and learn, right? What might be the right mix for one product or customer might be different for another. And so I think we're always looking for that shining star or the anchor of like our investment strategy that's going to, you know, we are able to double down on. So I think it comes the same when it comes to retail. I think like, don't be afraid to try, find a blend of the tactics that work for you and then double down on that investment. And then I will always just say, maintain the integrity and the heart of your brand, and don't be afraid to differentiate and keep iterating as you grow.
Awesome. Trace.
I guess my parting words would be the person who, or the company that figures out how to let people share data without losing its value is going to rule the world. I've certainly been racking my brain about that because, well, you know, what does it look like? Because the truth is, you know, again, when you're, especially on the CPG side, you know, your retailers hold really all your consumer data. I mean, because that's where things are purchased. I mean, most CPG have some D2C offerings, and those are great for learnings. And, you know, and they're certainly growing that side of it, but they're so far behind. So, you know, how do we figure out a way that lets brands understand and their consumers and their consumer behaviors, and still letting retailers, you know, monetize and benefit from that. And anybody who figures that out is going to, you know, talk about a legend in the space. That they'll be the Bill Gates or the Mark Zuckerberg of our industry. So I wish it was going to be me, but it's probably not.
It could be. Don't
Maybe.
Never say never.
Never know.
Patrick, you pretty much gave your parting words, but anything else before we come to a conclusion?
I mean, it's not new or a revelation by any means, but I think prioritization is so key. With so many choices in so many different areas, getting really, really clear on what matters to us right now. What do we need to do? What does success look like? And just doing a few things really well probably means more than trying to boil the ocean. So prioritization is always a good thing.
Well said. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of the panel, my friends. OhHello.io is launching next week. Trace, Patrick, and Sarah are wonderful people, all marketers with great experience. So excited to have them on our platform, where you can find time to book with any of them moving forward starting next week. And good luck to all. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Bye.